I became vegetarian when I was 16. It was a decision rooted in climate anxiety, and cutting out meat felt like one tangible thing I could do to reduce my environmental footprint. But it wasn't easy. I grew up eating a lot of meat. And even harder were the family tensions that arose over this decision. There was worry over my health. How are you going to get enough protein in your diet? And cultural judgment. You're just doing it because that's what's trendy among white people. That comment held both truth and irony. Truth, because at the time, vegetarianism and veganism were often promoted as health movements, with strict, narrow ideas of what was acceptable to eat. Things like kale, quinoa, and salads, none of which I grew up eating. At the same time, this cultural judgment felt ironic, because vegetarianism itself originated in Asia. In Buddhism, vegetarianism is a common practice grounded in compassion, non-harm, and living in alignment with your values. 16-year-old me didn't have the words to articulate the irony, but the feeling stuck with me, and now years later, I want to explore it more deeply. I decided to visit a Buddhist temple to see how vegetarianism can be understood through a different lens, one that connects me, as a diasporic Chinese Canadian, to my culture, rather than pulling me away from it, like my family once feared. I reached out to Lingyan Mountain Temple in Richmond, BC, where vegetarianism is practiced as a form of mindfulness and respect. They kindly let me observe and film their lunch service. I also interviewed 2 temple volunteers who were raised both Buddhist and vegetarian. This temple was closed to the public during COVID and has been under construction for a few years, but I was lucky enough to receive a tour from a volunteer who guided me around. I met this one volunteer, and she's been here for the past 19 years, and she was telling me about how much vegetarianism and food has changed throughout her time here. And one of those things is how much more Western food they cook. So sometimes schools come and they want to take a tour of the temple, and when they serve lunch, the first time they did it, they served Chinese food, and the students really did not like it. She called it troubleshooting, she said. In the future times that they came, they served spaghetti and lasagna and pizza, and I thought that was really interesting. She says generally for the younger generation, Gen Z and the millennials, they like to eat Western food, and so they cook more Western food. So there's more of a fusion. Now it's 10:30, and at 11 they serve lunch, and they have kindly invited me to come and see what lunch is like with the masters. So I'm very excited to take you along with me. Prior to the lunch service, the masters conduct a meal offering. They recite the 5 contemplations to encourage gratitude and self-reflection before the meal. Translated to English, they are the following. First, consider the labor that brought this food. Second, reflect on whether my virtue deserves this offering. Third, guard the mind against faults, especially greed. Fourth, regard food as medicine to sustain life. Fifth, accept this food to cultivate the path. The contemplation that really struck me was number 4, regard food as medicine to sustain our life, which means to view food as fuel, not as pleasure. I thought this was an interesting point because food is a source of joy for many people, societally and culturally. When I asked the volunteers how they reconcile the idea that food should not be viewed as pleasure, alongside the fact that food is closely tied to culture and community and memories, this is what they said.
I've definitely seen been at restaurants and the table next to me would just leave so much food. Because when we see it as pleasure, that's when I feel like we care less about it, because you're like, oh, there's so much of it, there's unlimited amounts of food, I can just not care about it, and that's where the waste comes in. So I think to see it as fuel, and just see it as oh, this is something that's precious, that's for me to nourish my body, to be healthy, and something that obviously all these people have put in effort to get to my table, is that's where when you have that humbleness and you're not just being greedy and taking more than you need, then that's where hopefully we'll be able to create a better society with less waste.
I'll admit, at first, I was skeptical of the meal contemplations. They felt abstract and unfamiliar to me. But hearing what they actually meant to those who truly value them helped me to see their purpose. It was to cultivate mindfulness, presence, and gratitude. It also made me realize that my skepticism came from a place of ignorance. Ironically, themes like mindfulness and gratitude have become really trendy in the West, yet they're often stripped from the very cultures that developed them. Practices like meditation and yoga are repackaged into secular wellness tools and are detached from their roots. This disconnect contributes to cultural erasure, and that's why I think it's so important to look beyond the surface and to understand where these traditions come from, and approach them with respect even if they don't immediately make sense to us. The contemplations were put into practice during the lunch service at the temple. Everyone ate in silence, no phones. People took only what they could eat, nothing more. And afterwards, volunteers came around with hot water so everyone could rinse out their bowls, ensuring no food went to waste. At the end of the meal, they offered gratitude to those who donated the food, giving them a blessing. That was my temple experience, and now I really want to reflect a bit deeper while I cook my favorite food of all time, vegetarian wontons or wontons. Number 1, I held subconscious skepticism for Buddhism and some of these practices, but they were rooted in ignorance, and ignorance can breed stigma, even within our own communities. Among Asian diaspora, it's not uncommon to see internalized oppression show up as shame or resistance towards practices like vegetarianism, traditional medicine, or even just speaking the heritage language. We see this in real life and on social media on how Asians monitor themselves, changing their accents, how they dress, what they eat to fit into a Western mold. There's a fear of being too Asian or not Asian enough, and growing up in a white suburban city, I definitely felt the former. This really leads into my next point, which is number 2, community. Just through observation alone and through my interviews, a common theme of why volunteers decided to become vegetarian was their community. They were never forced to be vegetarian, and they naturally came to that conclusion on their own based on the role models around them and their peers. On the other hand, me becoming vegetarian caused me to feel a sense of isolation from my Chinese identity and my Chinese community. For them, community was a mediating factor to feel proud of instead of isolated from their culture, as they'll elaborate.
I made a really great group of friends that genuinely I can call them friends for life. I would never be able to find with school friends. It's just not the same kind of bond. Not because religion, it's more we just have similar values. Everyone has their own take on religion. Some of my friends now, they don't even go to temple anymore, but we still are really close because we kind of grew up together and our values are still very similar.
Finally, number 3. Learning about Buddhist vegetarianism pushed me to reflect on my own relationship with my culture. For example, language. Growing up, I resisted learning Mandarin, especially since my peers only spoke English. I am now in the process of relearning Mandarin past the critical period for language acquisition, and it requires an immense amount of effort to retain and learn new characters and phrases that I would have easily picked up when I was younger. Even at the temple, I felt that gap. So much of the rich nuance in the chants, the texts, the teachings, it's lost in translation. Speaking the language is a big part of how strongly one identifies with their heritage, and it's reminded me of why I am putting in that effort in the first place to improve my Mandarin. Research shows that embracing biculturalism is associated with psychological and sociocultural benefits compared to monoculturalism, and that multilingualism in particular can have a positive influence on our cognition and brain development. Moving forward, I want to be more intentional with how I engage with my culture, and one way I'm doing that is through food. These wontons, for example, were traditionally made with pork, but this version still carries the memories I have associated with it. From wrapping them with my grandparents in Shanghai, to my mom surprising me with them after finishing my exams. I've realized that honoring my culture's food doesn't have to mean cooking it in the exact same way they've always been cooked. I used to have this all or nothing mentality. If I ate or cooked Chinese food, it had to be quote-unquote authentic, or I shouldn't bother cooking it anyways. But that's how recipes get lost. Instead, it can look like evolving my recipe repository and not being afraid to change things to preserve my unique cultural tie as a Chinese-Canadian vegetarian. To close this video, I asked the 2 volunteers what advice they give to people seeking to understand vegetarianism and Buddhism.
If you can't understand it, please just respect my decision. Like, you don't have to understand it. I don't expect everyone to understand me, but I think there is a basic level of respect that we can all have for each other, that like my dietary choices really doesn't affect you.
I guess like if there was one thing that I'd like to like maybe introduce them more to is kind of like, I think the idea of like compassion and like giving back, like especially when you fall into like a pretty like repetitive cycle, and sometimes it's easy to like lose your sense of purpose. But then like whenever I go back to like volunteer at temple, that's where I'm like, oh, I have like a purpose of like helping others, and like, you know, obviously it can extend beyond the temple, right? There's so many ways to like give back to society and like volunteer and stuff. Like at the end of the day, I think, you know, in this very divided society that we currently live in right now, like that's what we need more of, is like that interconnection and compassion for like each other and the planet.